David J. Skal was an enlightening author who was an expert on vampires and all things movie monsters. He had a special interest in the world of the classic Universal monster movies. He wrote books on the making of Dracula, the career of Todd Browning, and the life of Bram Stoker. He was also a comforting voice and cozy host on several documentaries he wrote and directed on the Universal monster movies, which were featured on the DVDs and Blu-rays for films such as Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, and The Creature from the Black Lagoon. He was a fun and intelligent writer and has now become an ever-increasing inspiration for my work on this channel. Probably the book he is most well known for is The Monster Show: A Cultural History of Horror. Originally published in 1993, the book serves as an overview of the development of the American horror film and how it parallels and speaks to the cultural fears and crises of its times. I just finished reading this book and wanted to talk about it, so in today's video, join me as I enter a new world of gods and monsters. Follow me through an examination of Skal's magnum opus on how strange and scary times inspired icons that redefined American culture and gave birth to a genre. Follow me behind the curtains and enter The Monster Show. Before reading this book, I had read Hollywood Gothic: The Tangled Web of Dracula from novel to stage to screen, Skal's behind-the-scenes look at the making of the classic 1931 horror movie. I enjoyed reading that book and found Skal to have a fun and unique voice that made me interested to learn more about that period in horror history. Reading The Monster Show was a revelation. He was able to expand that first book into a much broader look at the history of horror in a fresh, fun, and intelligent way. The opening chapters in particular are great. You can tell that he's passionate about this material, and he puts in the effort to set the stage, explain the context, and give you an in-depth idea of the culture that these films were born in. The major point that he brings up in these early chapters is how war affects a culture and how that manifests on the silver screen. He goes in depth on how World War I destabilized German society and how this cultural crisis helped give birth to the earliest of the horror films, the German expressionist films of directors like F.W. Murnau. He showcases Nosferatu as an early example of the power of the vampire and Dracula, and explores the cabinet of Dr. Caligari's influence on style and thematic elements of the early Hollywood horror films, and establishes his idea of the Dark Carnival. He describes the Dark Carnival as black Ferris wheels starkly silhouetted against lowering skies, nameless, shapeless things displayed in jars of formaldehyde, and the intuition of young boys that the glittering amusements of childhood somehow arrive in the dead of night on crepe-bedraped funeral trains. Leslie Fielder, discussing the similarly dark undercurrents of Huckleberry Finn and other American classics, notes that our literature as a whole at times seems a chamber of horrors disguised as an amusement park funhouse where we pay to play at terror and are confronted in the innermost chamber with a series of inter-reflecting mirrors which present us with 1,000 versions of our own face. This leads into his discussion of the deranged and obsessive early work of Todd Browning and eventually to the Grand Guignol in Paris. He gives us a wide view of the origins of the horror picture before diving into what he considers the true turning point for the genre, 1931. He makes a persuasive argument surrounding the three monumental American horror films of 1931, Dracula, Frankenstein, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as a moment where America entered the abyss of horrifying screen imagery and how this was informed by and reflected deep anxieties within America during the onset of the Great Depression. This then bleeds into Todd Browning's Freaks and his discussion of that film's financial failure. There are key arguments that he continually comes back to. His idea of war as the main driving anxiety that gave birth to horror is one of the key points of his entire book, and he makes a convincing argument for the power that the dual traumas of World Wars I and II had on the American psyche and how that continued to manifest for decades to come on the silver screen. The idea of horror as having serious cultural explanatory powers isn't an entirely novel argument, but in many ways, Skal was a serious writer who was taking horror seriously, which gave way to these arguments in more mainstream spaces. Of course, now in the era of elevated horror discourse, more of the mainstream is giving horror credit as a vehicle for social commentary or psychological insight, but Skal was doing that decades before and for much more critically reviled films. Another aspect that I love about this book is the wide variety of art forms he explores to prove his point about the cultural weight that horror holds. He looks at movies primarily, but also discusses theater, television, music, and literature quite frequently, which adds more evidence to his arguments. The earlier part of his book, or at least the earlier decades which take up a large portion of the book, is the clear highlight. He showcases a deep love, understanding, and expertise on these films and filmmakers in a way that is captivating to read. This part features in-depth examinations of the making of these movies and the context behind them in ways that were well researched and executed. As we get closer to his present day of 1993, this confidence and critical insight are weakened. A large chunk of horror films of the 80s were noticeably of much less interest to him, in particular, slasher films. This is unfortunate and leads to worse chapters in the later decades of the book. There is still some very insightful stuff. His expertise on vampires in particular bleeds through the page when discussing the connection between the AIDS epidemic and vampire fiction. However, some of this stuff doesn't age well either. Part of this could be the lack of critical distance to understand the importance of certain films and movements. The slasher example is a key example in this respect. Some of this, however, seems to just be points of personal obsession that don't particularly translate well to the page. The most notable example that felt off-putting to me was his discussion of plastic surgery. The first major problem with this is that he doesn't support his argument with the obvious tie-in with the body horror movement that was so dominant in the 80s. Instead, he spends pages detailing Michael Jackson's Thriller music video, the making of that, and Jackson's dealings with plastic surgery and transformation. This doesn't tie in with horror movies, and his arguments fall a bit flat. He brings up commercials he sees on television as connections to Dr. Frankenstein. This comparison is then drawn out further in a bizarre tangent about transsexual surgery. In it, he hysterically argues against these surgeries as examples of plastic surgery gone too far. Connecting them to mad scientist tropes, he paints a picture of a patriarchal medical system attempting to create its fantasy women through the bypassing of the traditional reproductive system, and therefore without the need for women. This is a disappointing rant that I was honestly stunned to read. Of course, it's not that shocking to read such open transphobia in something published in the 90s, but it stuck out to me due to Skal's insightful commentary on the AIDS epidemic and his thoughtfulness and compassion when discussing gay and lesbian people. Skal was a gay man, and his anger that he expresses in this book at the horrifying response to the AIDS epidemic that caused so many unnecessary deaths is completely warranted, understandable, and appreciated. However, I found myself a bit depressed at his lack of solidarity with trans people. The way he uses trans-exclusionary feminist arguments is frustrating, and it's something I would love to know if he regrets writing about in such a way, if he ever expressed a change of opinion on the matter. I tried to find info on that, but couldn't find any answers, which is disappointing because that was such an unexpected wrench to throw into an otherwise enjoyable read. This is only one example of how his commentary in the later chapters didn't hold up as well. I think partly his own biases, but also the fact that this was published in 1993 can probably explain his lack of contextual understanding of the impact that 80s horror films would have. Once he moved into a discussion of Stephen King, I did find him to be insightful once again, and he gave a good overview of his early career and the way his work impacted the culture. King is easy to take for granted nowadays, but he was and continues to be a behemoth of the genre and gave rise to so many other careers as a result of his overwhelming and consistent success. He goes into detail about the critical response to him, his financial and industry impact, and then brings us to a connection with Bret Easton Ellis's novel American Psycho. He compares the two and discusses the class dynamics at play in the reception of King's work as opposed to Ellis's controversial novel. This was an illuminating chapter that was much appreciated after the lackluster previous chapters. This was a continuation of his well-developed discussion throughout the book about how class dynamics and distinctions between low and high art were something that horror was constantly enveloped in, from the popular success that horror movies traditionally have generated and how that influenced the critical response to these movies through to horror finding its way into highbrow art. This invasion of higher art from horror, a genre traditionally seen as being exclusive to a low-brow populist sensibility, and this invasion being reviled by the intelligentsia, is something that comes up consistently. Skal uses this comparison between King and Easton Ellis to illustrate this continued trend in the reception of horror. This is something that you can still see today with discussions of elevated horror versus more mainstream horror. Skal was talking about this response to a more high art presenting horror decades before that cycle and showcases how it has been with us for decades. Of course, Skal debunks the idea that horror only recently became profound or interesting, or that it's only a sliver of the genre that's worth discussing in a serious manner, which is why I enjoy reading this book so much. After this, he then wraps up the book with a discussion of special effects bonanzas like James Cameron's Terminator 2 and Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. He finds them garish and messy in ways that reflect a growing trend in Hollywood. This perception of the changing of the industry was intelligent, even if I don't always agree with his takes on certain movies. His afterword, which was attached in the revised edition published in 2001, looks at Bill Condon's film Gods and Monsters, which was a film that tackled lots of the same themes as Monster Show. He compares this movie with the 1998 Godzilla remake and shows the connection between the themes of Condon's film with that of his book, and praises the strength of the imagery and depth of the movie, saying, "In short, Gods and Monsters, a small, intimate film, tells us more about the meaning and origins of horror icons than a dozen bombastic remakes of Godzilla ever could." In the afterword, he briefly touches on the major hits in the years since the book's release and doubles down on his vision of the genre as an ever-evolving creation that will always haunt us by projecting onto the screens our deepest fears and darkest desires. He ties it all back into his original points about war and the psychological scars it leaves on individual people, as well as the culture at large. His book is a mostly cogent look at the horror film industry in America, with detours into other art forms that are consistent and well-developed. While he has a better grasp and love for the earlier horror films, there are enough intelligent and well-developed insights in the later chapters to make it all worth reading. It's also filled with awesome photos throughout, and for those reasons, I recommend it for horror fans, as even in a sea of familiarity, I learned countless new things that deepen my understanding and appreciation for the genre. This is far from a perfect book. At moments, I cringed at his arguments, but there is a lot here that is worthwhile, and this is an example of the type of work I want to put into the genre. I could only wish to be half as insightful and interesting as Skal is. His death was a tragedy and a great loss for horror studies. This book is a testament to that. Check it out. That's all for today's video. If you liked what you saw, please hit like, subscribe, and don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. Thank you all for watching to the end, and I'll see you next time.